Nathaniel Comfort. Nathaniel's someone whose research has intersected with Cold Spring Harbor for a couple of decades, I'd say at this point, if not more. He's professor of the history of medicine at Johns Hopkins, and his most recent book on the history of medical genetics is called The Science of Human Perfection, 2012. Before that, he wrote a wonderful biography or biographically oriented work about Barbara McClintock called The Tangled Field. And he's been at work now on another biographically oriented project. And he's also done some really interesting work reflecting on the historical method of biographical work. But the upcoming biography is about Jim Watson, and I believe today's talk will draw from that biographical research and from Nathaniel's time as a Brenner Research Fellow here at CSHL. Thanks, Nathaniel.
Thank you, Alistair. It is wonderful to be back at Cold Spring Harbor again. As you say, it's been kind of a second home for me for a very long time. So it's great fun hearing talks by Erling and Robin. I really enjoyed these. I want to share just a tiny, as Robin suggested, Alistair suggested, I want to share a tiny piece of the work that I'm doing as part of my biography of Jim Watson. And it's one that I think will be broadly familiar to everyone, but this account, I hope, will be new to all. And it relies heavily on the Jim Watson papers here at Cold Spring Harbor, and as well on the Rosalind Franklin papers at Churchill College in Cambridge, Cambridge University. So Watson's 1968 book, The Double Helix, is, you probably all are familiar with it on some level, some quite intimately. This is among the best-selling works of popular science ever. It's sold millions of copies, and I want to argue that it is ranked at number 7 on the Modern Library's list of top 100 nonfiction books of the entire 20th century. Beat out Lewis Thomas by 4. And I want to argue that this is a misreading, that the book has been almost universally misread. And I'm going to talk about the double helix as the creation myth of molecular biology. And I'll say more about what I mean by that as we go along. But this is I've read this now extremely closely, and perhaps too closely. And it's a very strange and enigmatic book. It is part history, but it's also a part British comedy of manners like Kingsley Amis or Evelyn Waugh. It's part scientific discovery narrative. It's part coming of age story, and it has substantial elements of fiction woven into it. And the book mixes all of these genres to form a narrative of the origins of molecular biology and of Watson's role in this. And so the message here really is read The Double Helix. It's a fascinating book. I get more out of it every time I read it, but it must be read carefully and can't be taken necessarily at face value. So the original title for the book was, as many of you probably know, Honest Jim, and subtitled A Description of a Very Great Discovery. This is the ballpoint pen original copy of the title page that Watson created, and it's in the archives here. And it's dated August of 1962. It's 6 years before 5.5 years before the book was published, and notably 2 months before the Nobel announcement. This would have been about the time, according to Erling, in which the evaluations of the nominations would have been being written. Watson had a complete draft of the book by January of 1966. It did undergo substantial revision after that. But he had a lot of the book, the essence of the book dates to really the mid 60s, not the late 60s. And the title, I want to point out, is a sardonic nickname that was given to Watson by Bill Seeds, the same person, a postdoc in Maurice Wilkins's lab at King's College London, same lab where Rosalind Franklin worked. And he's the same person who gave Franklin the notorious nickname Rosy. Seeds was a very kind of sarcastic, sardonic guy, and he had a snarky nickname for just about everybody in the lab. And he called Jim Honest Jim in 1955. Okay? Watson thought that this was really funny because he sees him on a mountain. Watson's coming down, and Seeds just says, "How's Honest Jim?" and keeps going. And Watson thought that was funny and wanted to make that into the title of his book. It riffed on Kingsley Amis's Lucky Jim, which was published just the previous year, 1954, a sardonic comedy of manners set among the Oxbridge aristocratic intelligentsia that Watson both loved and laughed at. And so in 1966, 2 years before the book was published, he explained the title to his number one scientific mentor for his career, Max Delbruck, and said that his aim in the title was to indicate that doubt existed about my character, not to proclaim that I'm telling the honest truth. Right? So it's meant to be an ironic title. And so he's telling you, don't take this at face value, right? Meanwhile, the book is trying to do the work of history simultaneously. That's part of what makes it tricky. Okay, so like a novelist, Watson boils the dozens of people that had real connections to the Double Helix down to 5 main characters and a handful of bit players. We have William Lawrence Bragg, the director of the Cavendish Laboratory of Physics, Watson and Crick also at Cambridge, and then the other main group is the MRC Biophysics group at King's College London, and Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins, the main characters. The 5th main character is kind of off stage pulling the strings, Linus Pauling, the great physical chemist at Caltech, who Watson portrays as he and Crick being in a big race with to find the double helix. Pauling denied having any awareness of any kind of race with these guys. One was an immature postdoc, the other a superannuated grad student. He'd never heard of him. The race was mainly in Watson's mind. Again, this is part of what makes it a compelling narrative that is part of a big part of its popularity. Okay, so Watson took these main characters and leaving their names, their actual names, he turned them systematically into caricatures. Bragg, the stuffy Cambridge Don, Linus Pauling, the showman, the meek and mousy Maurice Wilkins, loudmouth Francis Crick. He did not spare himself either. Honest Jim is anything but honest. He describes himself as lazy, deceitful, vain, clumsy, shallow, and so forth and so on. These are all gags that are through the book, and the book is not often read as comedy. But the caricature of Rosalind Franklin is singularly harshly limbed. These lines on the screen now are from chapter 2 of the Double Helix, and probably familiar to many of you. This is where Watson first introduces Franklin, the character, which he calls Rosy. Again, that's Bill Seeds' nickname, one that all of the folks, Watson, Crick, Wilkins, and others, used in their correspondence at the time. So we know that they did call her that, and many have said that she did not like it, so they only used it behind her back. She could be quite fierce. And this Rosy is an awful person. She's a dowdy, shrewish, unimaginative drudge whose main role in the story is apparently to block scientific progress, right? She's plodding and methodological and meticulous. And at the book's climax, we learn that Franklin held the magic photograph that reveals the double helix when Wilkins shows it to Watson without her knowledge. Well, historians have known for some time that Watson's portrayal of Franklin was substantially drawn from Morris Wilkins's hostile view of her contemporary to those events. The friction between Wilkins and Franklin began with a malicious understanding created by their mutual supervisor, John Randall, and was further amplified by personality differences. Most of Watson's experience of Franklin before the double helix was filtered through Wilkins, and his nastiness doesn't completely explain Watson's treatment of Franklin, but it does explain quite a bit. Even more can be revealed by drilling down into Watson's creation of the Rosy character. And here, this absolutely could not have been done without the Cold Spring Harbor archives. Watson saved all of the drafts of the double helix as he was working on it, from handwritten holographs to proofs and galleys and published copy. And Watson has been very generous in granting me access to this collection. I've spent a fair amount of time on it by now. Reading through successive drafts of a given passage in the book enables us to look at exactly how Watson turned Rosalind Franklin, the scientist, into the notorious drudge Rosy. Okay? So we can look at several different drafts here and compare the way he introduces her. In the first draft of this chapter, it started out as chapter 4. He later moved it to chapter 2. He introduces her the first time in a very straightforward way. He just said, Morris wanted some help, and their in crystallography, and their choice was a woman trained in Cambridge and with several years' experience after her PhD. Her name was Rosalind Franklin, and that's that. Right? As expected, he continues, Rosalind was an efficient worker, and soon she was obtaining even better photographs than Morris. Well, there's nothing horrible or sexist, obviously, there. She's he treats her as very straight. She's still a scientific person in this version. We go to the next version of January 1966. He's recast her considerably. Now he says, however, it was impossible for Morris to get his mind off Rosalind Franklin. Not that Morris was at all in love with Rosy, as we called her from a distance. At least outwardly, they completely despised each other. Ordinarily, this should not have mattered. Even if you are married to a woman, he says, you don't have to go near her. Now, that's a rather unfortunate joke that, not all of the jokes in the double helix land. But you can see how he's casting her in more and more kind of high contrast and ever snarkier kinds of ways. Later that year, when he briefly changed the title of the book to Base Pairs, he made a couple of, he makes minor changes as he goes in further drafts. So here he introduces the idea of Franklin as Wilkins's assistant, which she had very good reason to believe she was not, because Randall had told her that she was not anybody's assistant. The project, the DNA work, was hers alone. But Wilkins, again, did think that she was to be his assistant. Again, he's looking at her through Wilkins's eyes. And so here are the final versions that were published, actually the published versions in the book. Okay. One difference here is you know, he simplifies the last sentence, saying almost from the moment she arrived in Morris's lab, they began to upset each other. A woman editor who came in 1967, fortunately, had the wisdom to cut that last joke about not having to go near your wife. Continuing on this passage, just a couple more sentences. He writes that within several months of her arrival, she began to regard the X-ray study of DNA as her private study. Okay? And then goes on with this notorious descriptions of her appearance, never lipstick to contrast with her black hair, and her dress showed all the imagination associated with blue stocking intellectuals. In 1966, he changed her private study of DNA to regarding DNA, the X-ray study of DNA, as her own domain, which makes it even stronger, that, you know, the sense of possessiveness and territoriality that heightens the amount of conflict in the story. So these are narrative rhetorical devices that he's using to amplify the friction here with Franklin. And he modifies the descriptions of her physically, so making her black hair long black hair, which it wasn't at the time, and changes blue stocking intellectuals to blue stocking adolescents. So again, in each step, making her seem, you know, more of a harsh caricature, less and less of a person. In base pairs, he continues with the regarding her own domain as DNA. She did not see the situation this way. Morris wanted an assistant. Rosy did not see the situation this way and claimed that she'd been given DNA for her own problem, would not think of herself as Morris's assistant. Again, this was absolutely, this is true, and was the basis of a major misunderstanding between Franklin and Wilkins that was caused apparently deliberately by John Randall. And her hair changes and so forth. Okay, so, you know, what I want to show with this is that through these various iterations of Honest Jim, Watson progressively exaggerates Franklin's qualities until she becomes a cliche. And this is a basic technique of the book. Again, he made all of the major characters into cliches, including himself. But Franklin's caricature comes off as uniquely harsh and cruel. So she's, you know, this shrewish drudge, a disciplinarian. She's unimaginative. She's obstructionist. She's basically like a schoolmarm. Right? This caught my eye because of some work by a literature scholar from Stanford named Rebecca Wilbanks, who's written about the rhetoric around synthetic biology, a field that grew directly out of the double helix and molecular biology and early genetic engineering. In 2005, one of the leaders of that field, Drew Endy, a big fan of comics and science fiction, wrote and produced his own comic book about a young biohacker. And our hero here is a boy, a schoolboy, curious, heedless, mischievous, driven, passionate. And his teacher, on the other hand, urges him to follow the rules, to learn the science, to be safe and cautious. And the boy succeeds in his goal of creating synthetic life by milking what information he can from her and sprinting ahead onto the unknown, leaving her behind. Right? So this is an all too familiar trope that we see in Rosalind Franklin. These are not the only cases. And so she's, you know, the woman becomes the obstacle to the bright young boys, the bold creative hacker or or crystallographers in the case of the double helix, who breaks the rules and gets the reward. Right? Another related myth that I want to try to at least destabilize for you is the climax of the double helix, in which Wilkins shows Watson a photograph, an X-ray diffraction image of DNA, which is now famously known as photograph 51. He reports his jaw dropping and his pulse racing, and his writing suggests that photograph 51 gave him the double helix, and that's how the book has been read. That photograph 51 becomes this sort of magical talisman that gives you the secret of life. But if you read the text closely, all he actually says is that when he saw this, he realized that DNA was helical. This was something he had known for at least 16 months, okay, and has been widely talked about. There's nothing new there. This passage is not history. It's actually science writing. Watson boils a whole lot of abstruse science that, all the technical details of X-ray crystallography are just mind-boggling. And he boils that down to a single photograph that the reader can picture, because it's easy for a layperson to understand. The image did, in fact, there's always a grain of truth here. The image did have an emotional impact on Watson, and it was a trigger for him and Crick to start actively building models that led in a few weeks to the solution of the double helix. But the main importance of photograph 51 was social, not scientific. Photograph 51 could not have given Watson the double helix. Crick, for example, to just underscore that, Crick never mentioned photograph 51 in his accounts of the double helix. It was purely Watson. Okay? The photo 51 story adds to the cruel misperception of Rosalind Franklin. This photograph didn't give her the double helix as it appears to have given Watson. It implies that she was too obstinate, too dogmatic, even to interpret her own data. In the myth, Franklin is holding on to the magic key, the secret of life, for 10 months. She took the picture with her student Raymond Gosling in May of 52. Watson sees it in February 53. And Franklin is holding on to this secret of life, in a drawer, not looking at it, until without recognizing what it was. And then Watson waltzes in, takes a quick glance at it, and solves the structure, right? So this story reduces Franklin's contributions to a single photograph that she couldn't even interpret. Okay, that's nonsense. And I won't go into the details of exactly how that's nonsense. I'm happy to talk about it afterward. But just as a way of showing how these myths can affect people differentially. Last Franklin myth, very briefly, emerged as a backlash against Watson's Rosy character. In 1975, 7 years after the double helix came out, Franklin's friend Anne Sayre published a polemical account of Franklin's life that does write the record in many ways, but it's ham-handed and inaccurate in many other ways. And the author Horace Freeland Judson wrote of what he called the myth of the wronged heroine that grew up around Franklin after this book in the late 70s and 80s. As a result of backlash against Watson's portrayal. Franklin's biographer, Brenda Maddox, agreed and noted that Franklin had become a feminist icon, but also a martyr. The Sylvia Plath of molecular biology, a genius whose gifts were sacrificed to the greater glory of the male. So this myth, while well-intentioned, turned Franklin into a passive victim and stripped her of her agency and reduced, again, her contributions to just one photograph. And so the myth of the wronged heroine reduces Franklin to this single image, and now the photograph 51 becomes emblematic of not only advance in science, but sexism in science, right? And it ignores her important earlier work on DNA and her later superb work on RNA and tobacco mosaic virus. So to wrap up, creation myths in science affect, myths in general, affect women scientists differently from men. They tend to favor those people who are in power, who hold the power already. So they're often triumphalist stories in which in which the winners tell the story of how they won. But this is not necessarily the case. Myths do not have to operate this way. We will always have creation myths about science, about the world, about life. Creation myths can't help reflecting the values, beliefs, and knowledge of their time. And so they need to be updated periodically. So looking closely at the available documents and understanding our origin stories as the result of historical contingent forces is essential if we want those stories to reflect what we believe is true. So thank you very much. I can take questions if there are any.
Thanks, Nathaniel. And I'd suggest, closing the screen so people can see you. Any questions for Nathaniel? Again, using the reaction tab at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand. Nathaniel, let me go
Maybe
first.
Maybe I could give a few comments because the discussion about Rosalind Franklin and the Nobel Prize. So because she died in 1958, she was never nominated. And the paradox about the double helix is that the first nominations came in 1960, 7 years after the discovery. And they were by Bragg. He thought he could get both the crystallographers and the nucleic acid, Watson and Crick, in for the prize. And it caused a lot of discussions in the committees. And there was Arne Tiselius who sorted this out and said, I will let the prize in physiology and medicine cover DNA, and the crystallographers will get the prize in chemistry. You know? But although she was never nominated, she is reviewed in 1958. You can see the comments on her work and the respect for her work. So the obvious conclusion, had she been alive, I think the outcome of that prize could have been very, very different. Or it could have, at least could have been a lot of discussions back and forth.
That's fascinating. I did not know that she was reviewed in 1958.
It was.
I would love to see that. Thank you for that.
I'm sure I can help you with that, Jonathan.
Oh, that would be great. Yes, we'll talk offline. I've got a bunch of questions for you.
Sure.
Let me go to Robin.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's having the ability to sort of put the drafts next to each other and watch the revision process is just sort of intoxicating, and sort of as a method for this. And I guess I want you to sort of comment a bit more on the force of the caricatures that are being brought in. And I think that what you were discussing is in terms of the portrait of a scientist as sort of male and playful, and sort of maybe a little bit heedless. It's just such an interesting, as you said, it's a myth. It's a way of constructing the identity of scientists. And I'm not sure if there are other parallel myths or sort of constructions of molecular biology or molecular biologists that might be worth also recalling in the process of contextualizing this one particular process.
Yeah. One thing, that's a great question, Robin, and thank you. One thing I can say speaks to it is that in the interest of time, I cut some slides about earlier narratives of the double helix discovery that appeared in in newspapers and magazines, and one that didn't even get published in the end, that portray the discovery very, very differently. In a nutshell, they portray the DNA work as being the result of two teams, an experimental team at King's College London and a theoretical team at Cambridge. And those teams in the various different accounts are interacting, sharing data, correcting one another, inspiring one another. And in one of those in particular, that was written by a woman author, not a science writer, but just a general journalist, Stringer, gave Franklin real emphasis, portrays her as the leader of the experimental group in London, and actually asked her for comments on her piece. So there are other myths out there that we can tell, right? And I will be bringing these out and laying them out for you all, hopefully when the book comes out. But I think you may also have been asking about accounts about other discoveries.
I'd take those too, but that's actually a really wonderful. I think that's wonderful and sort of keeping within the scope of this paper, as opposed to just the general interest that the question inspires.
It's a great question. I'll think about it more. Thank you.
Maybe I could give just another comment. You didn't mention the fact that the manuscript was offered to Harvard University Press, and they declined it because there was such a critical comment from both Wilkins and Crick. Particularly Wilkins had made some fantastic statement that I used on slides, how he think it all denigrates the seriousness of the matter, they as persons and so forth. So that is an interesting dimension. And I guess later on, Harvard University Press not have regretted that they had it.
Yes, it is. Thank you. I didn't include that also in the interest of time, but it's the biggest mistake Harvard University Press ever made, financially. And Wilkins and Crick they initiated a lawsuit against the university press. And it's unclear to me to what extent Nathan Pusey, the president of Harvard, was backing away from that controversy, or just, he gave another more diplomatic reason. But as it turned out, Thomas J. Wilson, Watson's editor, was retiring anyway and started this new press, Athenaeum, and had an absolute blockbuster with one of his first books.
Nathaniel, I'm inclined to be very persuaded by the idea that the book needs to be read as in a variety of genres, or as a combination of genres beyond sort of science reportage or history proper. And I think that would apply not necessarily the same genres, but the same type of argument. For me, it would work well to explain some of the curious things about Darwin's Book of Recollections, that's commonly called his autobiography.
Interesting.
But I had to wrestle with that at the end of my book on Darwin, because his recollections contradict in many ways a lot of the elements of the correspondence and research notes that he made earlier in his career. And so it's been a thing that a lot of Darwin scholars have had to confront and try to figure out reasons why. Oftentimes our historical arguments have a pre-refutation from this thing that Darwin wrote at the end of his life. But that's to say, I found it helpful myself to suggest that work of Darwin's in some respects reflected a genre, or was intended for a genre other than kind of pure biography or history, but it was kind of a set of morality tales or tales about education and cultivation of career for his own children, because it was not originally intended as a public document necessarily. But that's all to say, I'm totally prepared to be convinced by the genre element, the argument that Watson was pulling from types of writing that would have been familiar to his readers. Do you see a sense of conscious copying of tropes, echoing the Amos novel, things like that? Is it a case where you think, either through interaction with editors and interlocutors, that this is something that he maybe cultivated as a skill, a learned skill in the course of doing the writing? Or do you see it more as a sense that these genres are somehow intrinsic to the culture and you kind of know how to deploy them regardless of your level of skill and training as a writer?
That's a fantastic question, Alistair. And I'm going to say right off the bat that to really give an answer, I'm going to need to dive back into these chapters and compare some of these versions more closely still. But there are a couple of things one can say about it now. One is that it was very difficult to persuade Watson to do anything that he didn't want to do. So he more, less facetiously, all of the things that he was doing, all of the genres I suggest he was drawing upon, were things that were deeply important to him. From the love of Cambridge and the English comedies of manners, which he was in fact reading and laughing at and enjoying greatly. And I can see him making jokes that sound like upstairs, downstairs in his letters home to his family when he visits places like Oxford. So that much is true. Most importantly, I think he did say several times in letters in the mid-60s that he wanted to produce a work of great literature. We can interpret that how we will, but he certainly had literary aspirations when he was writing the book. And the third thing that I think is maybe the most important is that the book is really, if you want to focus down more than just general lay audiences, he was most interested in young people who were in late high school, early college, who he could draw into science. He was trying to make science seem fun, not dry and boring, and to attract good young students into it. And that is something that, first of all, that's when Watson himself got introduced to science. So there's an autobiographical element there. But he continued, that continued to be a priority of his for many decades, all the way through the Eton fellowships, in the 90s and 2000s, when he had students come and stay in his house and work in the lab. So that's a long-standing priority of Watson's. So editors may have nudged him on specific techniques. A lot of them are really kind of rough and hand-handed when you look at them closely. So, I would need to go back. There are marked up editorial versions of this, and I'm going to need to go back to those and see if I can be more precise in that. But I do know that the general priorities are things that were very much Watson's own priorities.
Thanks so much, Nathaniel. Well, we've just slightly exceeded our scheduled time, so I think it's my duty to call a close to the formal proceedings here and to thank all three of our speakers today, Erling, Robin, and Nathaniel, and also to send best wishes to Mila as well. Thanks to all of you for attending. I want to give a special thanks to my colleagues, Mila, Tom, and especially Tricia, for helping to organize this event. And finally, I really want to urge you, everyone in the audience, and the speakers as well, having seen the richness of the CSHL archives as reflected in the talks here, to encourage your colleagues, students, yourself, if you haven't already done so, to apply for our Sidney Brenner Research Fellowship or to one of our research travel grants. We really look forward to engaging with future scholars coming in and following in the footsteps of the colleagues who've spoken here today. So thanks again to all three of you, and thanks to the audience.
You.
Thank you.